Welcome to video 11. The next step in this course is to create the categories object. This is going to handle any and all tasks related to categories, specifically retrieving and displaying categories. So I'm going to be working with the m_categories.php file located within app models. And I'll start with an opening PHP tag and the usual comment. Like so, and I'll open it up with class categories. Since this is going to be an object that has a connection to the database and uses that quite often, I'm going to add private database and private db_table. And db_table, I'm going to set that to equal categories. This gives me an easy way to change the table name if I need to. Once I have my variable set up, next thing is to do my constructor. And in this case, it's not going to be blank. In this particular case, I'm going to add global database. And the use of the global here means that I can access variables that have been created outside of the scope of this particular object, which means I can access the global database object that I created within my init.php file. So global database gives me access to that, and then this database equals database just gives me an easy way to refer to the database and to retrieve information from it. Now a little bit of space and a comment. So this section of code is going to be for setting or getting categories from the database. So I'm going to have public function get categories, and it's going to have an ID which is potentially set to null. And this particular function is going to return an array with category information. And ID is going to be a numeric ID, so it's going to be an int. Now within this function, let me add some spaces at the bottom of this file so you can see this better. We're going to create a data variable, which is going to be an array. And then we're going to check for an ID. So if an ID does not equal null, then I'll have an else. So if a data does not equal null, we're looking for a specific category. And if no ID is set, then we're looking for all categories. Okay, so let's fill in our database query. So we're going to be using some MySQLi to connect to the database to access that table and retrieve the information we need. So if statement equals and we're going to use a prepared statement here because I want to pass in information into my query and I want to make sure it's escaped properly. So I'm going to do select ID name from, and then I'm going to add in this DB table and then where ID equals question mark limit 1. And the limit 1's there because we're only looking for one specific category. So if the statement's able to be prepared successfully, we're going to bind our parameters. And the parameter that we're talking about, it replaces any question marks that we have within our query. And the ID is an int, so that's why it's an I. And then we're going to pass in the ID variable, which was set when this get categories was called. And then we're going to execute. And then we're going to store the result. And assuming everything goes successfully, then we need to bind the result. So this takes the results of this query, because we specifically selected ID and name, and we want to save them in two variable names. In this case, I'm going to call it cat ID and cat name. And once they're bound in properly, assigned to these variables, then we're going to do stmt fetch to complete the process. And we're going to check if there were returned rows. If stmt, num rows is larger than 0, we're going to set our data variable that we set earlier, data equals array, and it's going to be an associative array, so our ID equals cat ID, and name equals cat name. And then we'll close our statement. And all the way at the end of this function, we're going to return data. So this getCategories function just specifically returns an array of data that's been pulled from the database. If ID is set, it's going to pull a specific result, and if no ID is set, it's going to pull an array of all the items in the database. So let's fill out the second portion of this. And again, we're going to do another database query, if, and just so I'm clear, we don't need to do a prepare line because we're not dealing with any variables that need to be inserted into our query. So we can just do if result equals this database query. We do select star from, we're going to call in the database table name, order by name, and that'll arrange things alphabetically. Okay, so if result equals the database query of select star from the database table name, order by name, that'll retrieve all the categories, and we need to make sure that there are actually categories to display. So if result num rows is larger than 0, then we're going to do while row equals result fetch array. So basically what it does is it tries to get the results of this query and checks if there are an appropriate number of rows to return. If there are more than one row, it's going to loop through each of those rows, and it's going to set a temporary row variable that'll hold the return data from this query. And every time it loops within the while loop, I want to do data equals array. And make sure you don't forget these brackets here, because we want to add to this data variable each time. So data equals array, and we want to store ID. And it's kind of similar to what we did up here, except ID equals row ID. And again, this row refers to the data that's being retrieved from the database. And then also name. Like so. And I believe that takes care of this particular method within this object. So let's go ahead and test this, see if I made any spelling mistakes or if there are any issues with my code. So let's go to init.php. Let's change things a little bit. Let's have this top comment here be include objects. And then create objects. So I'm going to copy this line and paste it in. And then rather than template, I'm going to be using categories. Like so. So that will include our categories file. It'll create the categories object. And let's do a test so we can make sure that our function, that our method is working correctly. So let's go to index.php. Let's comment out the current contents. Let's do an echo pre. Echo closing pre. And if you're not familiar, the pre just refers to a pre-formatted HTML tag. And that's going to make what we're displaying next using printr look a little nicer. So we're going to print our categories, get categories. So this should display all the categories that we have in our database. So let's take a look in Chrome. Let me just refresh the page, and you'll notice we get a nice array of arrays. And each of these arrays represents one category. So you'll notice we have 3 total categories: clothing, electronics, and toys. And they're organized nicely in alphabetical order. Let's check the other side of that method. Let's try looking up category with an ID of 3. I'll save that, refresh the page. You'll notice we only get one particular array now. So that's working correctly. Join me in the next video. I'll be talking about how we create the navigation within our e-commerce system.